Thank you, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. During the past 10 days, we saw an atrocious action conflicted upon Gaza and Palestine by Israeli military forces. There was a battle that resulted in more than 150 non-combatants of Palestine died of that action caused by Israel. We think that is a clear problem, and once that we have now difficultly achieved armistice, it is now the time we should have a military security guarantee by Egyptian military. That is the basic stance, very clear. We are advancing on open government. What I'm going to do in Prime Minister's speech is we're first going to contextualize what kind of problem do we face today, and thus we're going to provide our policy to this. Very simple. Second of all, we're going to talk about why it is now very necessary and urgent to have military for Gaza region. Third of all, I'm going to talk about why Egyptian military is the right actor to do this job in the first place. So moving on. What is the problem of today's case in the motion? As I've told you, there were 8 days of invasion by Israel of Gaza region that resulted in 150 non-combatants' death to Palestine. On the other hand, while Israeli was only 6 of them were dead in those processes. We see a clear asymmetry of military power, so that there is a clear problem existing in the status quo. So these Israeli military just tried to simply bomb the whole city of Gaza, and then resulting not only the death of non-combatants, but also they killed the military leader of Hamas. We think that is actually very critical to that to their situation. There is a clear asymmetry of power. So the situation and the only way to solve this problem in the current status quo is the international society and the Arab society has to beg for Israel that you should stop the problem. And that's only Israel who can make this call to stop it. That is why Hillary Clinton and President Morsi of Egypt also went through those regions and went through a series of negotiations to reach armistice, which was a very difficult process. We think that is the current context that we are talking about today. So what is our policy in this situation? We think that Egyptian military and the leadership should be, first of all, dealing with the problems of Palestine and Israel, first in a way of diplomatic measures. But when that fails, and when by any chance Israel tries to invade and attack Gaza region and Palestine first, for whatever reason, we think that these Egyptian military should be put in that situation for defensive characteristics, defensive purpose. That is our clear stance. So moving on, why do we have to have this policy, and why is it necessary? Why is it so urgent? We already told you that, first of all, in the perspective of these non-combatants and innocent citizens who are just having no choice but to face the deaths and the attacks from the Israeli military, we think their lives are imminently threatened but by no good reason. We think, foremostly importantly, we have to protect the lives of these innocent citizens at the first place. And especially in case of Gaza, the region is actually surrounded by the territory of Israel. It is actually isolated from the other region of Palestine. We think in those situations, this region is especially more vulnerable of the attack and invasion of Israel. And that is why we think Egyptian military should especially take into consideration of the protection of Gaza when there is a clear asymmetry of military power. The exact thing happened by Israel is that they tried to announce that we're going to not only going to bomb by missiles or rockets the area of Gaza, but also they tried to set that we're going to commence and input the ground army forces into the Gaza region. Why is that? So the reason they got brought up was that because there could be arms smuggled and hide in civilian houses. We have no choice but to search their people's houses and get rid of that arms at the first place. We think that is the same violation of human rights and the laws of war. When it comes to, it's just like looting the people's living and whatsoever. We think that is very atrocious, conducted by Israel. But the problem here is that there's no preventive measure because, as I've clearly told you, there's a clear asymmetric military power existing in the current status quo. And especially Israel is, ideologically backed up by the United States. That is why there could be no clear preventive measure by even the Palestine military to have the situation deterred. So, in this situation right now, after the 8 days of atrocious battle, when these kind of major actors, United States, Egypt, Israel, and Hamas, Palestine, have altogether difficultly reached an armistice, which is a very precious situation that we want to be maintained, we think that there should be a deterrent or preventive measure that this kind of atrocious action should not be happening in the future again. Because if we just say that we'll have a peaceful agreement, whenever Israel is unsatisfied with a certain situation, they can easily conduct the attack invasion once again, and then we have no situation but to face the same damage once again. That is why we think Egyptian military can work as a deterrent in this situation when we have achieved a very careful armistice and negotiation. We think that at worst cases, when Israel actually tries to invade Gaza, we think Gaza should be at least in a fair ground to defend their people and defend their property whatsoever. That is why we think it is also going to promote the stability of the Middle East. Because now that Israel is actually confronting animosity among Middle East countries, we think that when Egyptian military is working as a security guarantee in Gaza, these people will think that where our stability is going to be achieved furthermore. Without this kind of preventive measures, we think that is not achieved. But third of all, why Egypt military is actually the right actor in this case? We think that it is very clear. Because the leader of the current Egyptian military is President Morsi, who was newly elected this year, and his political party, the Muslim Brotherhood, is the mother organization of Hamas. So that is why they share ideological companionship between Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood. That is why actually, in the perspective of Hamas and Palestine, they can trust this actor, that they can guarantee security for themselves. But we think Egypt is not only, lopsided to only Palestine, because they have shown a clear leadership in the process of 8 days negotiation, that there can be a balance between Palestine and Israel. Why is that so? When Israel actually required Egypt to actually stop the smuggling of arms coming from other African countries into Palestine, they actually did bomb a car with 100 armheads coming from Libya, and that is why they got trust from Israel, and that is why Israel actually agreed to have armistice in the first place. We think the Egyptian military is actually working upon as a fair and credible actor for the stability of Middle East. That is why we think there is the right actor. So we think, and moreover, definitely, because after the Arab Spring movement, they have also got the credibility of the United States as well. We think the Egyptian military and President Morsi is the right actor to have not only diplomatic measures, but also when it comes to conflicts, they have a fair reputation and balance to deal with all those situations. So, Mr. Speaker, our case is very clear. When there is a situation that there's a big military power asymmetry, and Israel can choose whether or not to invade in those cases, we think at the worst case they should have a fair ground of defense, and we think Egyptian military is the very right actor for doing this. So, we are very proud to propose.
Okay, I thank the Prime Minister for his speech. And now I invite the Leader of the Opposition to open their case.
Mr. Speaker, obviously the opening government knows this case quite well on facts, right? There are a lot of troubles happening, and ultimately we want a third party to go in. What we are confused, however, on the opening opposition is specifically when we speak of military security guarantee, you simply can't say Egypt has power, therefore we can completely trust this entity or this country to come in. We want them to actually contextualize this debate into what kind of world would be actually created and why that's the world that they want to see in the future, and hence their support for a military security guarantee. Because we didn't quite hear a clear idea of what Egypt's role would actually be, when already they have a diplomatic advantage, when already they are creating a symbol of trust in this region. What is the dire necessity for a military presence of this country in a region that's already turbulent? We failed to hear that analysis coming from Chunak's speech. But because, as a good fellow, I need to rebut, I'm just going to include that in our own arguments, because our arguments are as follows. First, we're going to talk to you on a principle level why intervention of a third party in any situation is quite negative. It's something that the opposition bench will not stand for. But furthermore, in the context of debate, we're going to analyze, number one, why not in Gaza that this third party intervention is unnecessary and uncalled for. But secondly, why specifically Egypt is simply not the party that needs to go in, even if we concede that perhaps military presence is important. My second speaker, Tony, as a good second speaker should, will talk about the harms now. So let's talk about what they said. So basically, he gives a pretty elaborate history about what's been happening for the past week. We absolutely agree that, finally atrocities have ceased. Finally, there has been some kind of peaceful agreement upon various parties, especially between Hamas and Israel. And they tell us that this call for peace was brought upon by Hillary Clinton and President of Egypt. We tell you that that's the very unique role that we need to preserve and perhaps enhance for the peace and stability of the Middle East. But more about that later. Furthermore, they talk about, how armed struggle, how the cause of this conflict in itself was because Israel was so suspicious, and hence, that caused such conflicts and arms and all this death to occur. We ask you then, provide us the logical link of how having a third-party military presence would lessen the suspicion or lessen the tension that Israel feels towards Hamas or towards Palestine or towards, the Muslim world as a whole. We fail to hear that, again, about how this trust would be automatically established. Furthermore, he even tells us that, look, Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood, Egypt and Palestine, essentially the same in ideologies or, identities. We tell you that's the very problem we want to know, but again, more about that later. So first, on a principle level, intervention of why the third party is bad. Mr. Speaker, we tell you we tell you in a situation where you have two parties that fundamentally differ on the level of government structure, of ideologies that they support, of the ethnicities, and very goal and existence of the country is at stake. You simply cannot have a third party intervening, because ultimately, a third party can never stay neutral to an ideological battle, to a religious and ethnic battle that determines your very identity as a state, your very existence as a state. Specifically, when we talk about Gaza, like they characterize head-on, that it's a region that's surrounded by Israel, isolated from the rest of Palestine as a whole, we think that it's ever more a sensitive region in which we should bar third parties from entering. But yes, sir.
But after the Arab Spring movement, the regime change, Egypt successfully reached a negotiation between Hamas and Israel. So how can you say that you ultimately deny the capability of Egypt?
We're not denying the capability of Egypt. What we're saying is that their capability exists because it stays on a diplomatic level, on a neutral ground where diplomatic achievements are occurring. But when that characteristic turns into a military one, when that one turns into sustaining or stopping a military intervention of characteristics, that's the problem that we have. We're not distrusting the Egyptian government's capability. What we're distrusting is once you differentiate the characteristic from a diplomatic, peaceful one to a military power, that's the change in perception of both parties from Hamas and Israel sit down. So specifically, Mr. Speaker, that's where we're going to talk about why not Egypt. They tell us, look, Egypt cooperated when Israel wanted to stop arms from Africa, and therefore, all of a sudden, trust was established. Mr. Speaker, we think it's a rare gift that we have a Muslim state that Israel can actually begin to trust. We tell you that Israel, as an isolated country within the Middle East for religious and ethnic reasons, has not been able to trust the Middle East. That's why they still have countries in the Middle East that deny the very existence of Israel, such as Iran, that they don't want them to exist on the face of this map, right? So when they tell us that, look, now Israel's trying to trust Egypt, we tell you that's the value you need to enhance, and that's the level that you want to sustain. But how does military security guarantee actually sustain that diplomatic status or that diplomatic influence? Because we tell you that once you evolve the military to go in, you can't remain neutral anymore. Even if a diplomatic status is already agreed upon, military completely evolves the characteristics of the relationship itself. Before I go on, yes, sir.
The alternative model of your case, which the diplomatic negotiation is the way to go, has a timeline problem. While the negotiation is going on, which is not guaranteed to be solved, there are people dying ongoing.
So on one hand, you want to trust diplomatic measures, but on the other hand, you're saying it might not work, so let's have the military go in. That's the discrepancy coming from the opening government, because we tell you that diplomatic relations, as feeble or perhaps as unstable as they are is the direction that the international society is moving towards, and is the very reason that we have faith that one day peace will be achieved in the Middle East. You simply cannot add another military power simply because you don't trust in that diplomatic power. Mr. Speaker, we tell you that now it's the same analogy when we even come to in the context of Northeast Asia, right? When you have North Korea and South Korea obviously hating each other for the sake of it, and you have China and Russia playing in as perhaps neutral parties for negotiating ground. That's when diplomacy begins, and that's when stability is achieved. Not when you have the Chinese military coming in to stabilize the region. We think the same logic applies for the Middle East. You simply cannot bring in military powers because military conflict is occurring. Because we tell you, because of the very close ties that Egypt has with Hamas, that Israel is already a suspicious state. Israel is already a turbulent state that acts provocatively on a very small notice. The opening opposition is not here to say that Israel is doing a good job and Israel is the way to go. What we're telling you, however, is when you're dealing with a turbulent state that's already suspicious of its neighbors, that's already mistrusting of the region around it for various reasons, and has finally started to develop some sort of partnership on a diplomatic level with a Muslim state, where do you go about that and where do you carry the future of that relationship? You simply don't ruin it by bringing them as a military force that somehow may or may not neutralize or stabilize the region. Because again, Mr. Speaker, the opening government never provided to us how that neutral stance would even exist when it comes to military, and how that would even play out in the scenario that they depict, when we again are thanking the fact that finally a ceasefire is agreed upon. So if you believe in actual stability in Gaza and among the Palestinians and the Israelis, we simply don't think bringing in Egyptians will solve the problem. For those reasons, we're very proud to pose this motion.
Okay, I thank the Leader of the Opposition for her speech, and now I invite Deputy Prime Minister to continue their case.
Mr. Speaker, it's very clear that the government is not trying to say they were not suddenly going to have military intervention in Gaza region. What we're trying to say is that we're going to recognize military security as the last resort, which upon the people living in Gaza can actually rely upon in cases of this kind of conflict coming again and again and again. And thank you, Hyun-na, for saying what the problems of the government case are. But the problem is you're actually revealing the weakness of your case as well, because they said how there's a suspicion going on. But when we say, Mr. Speaker, that these suspicions actually lead to killings of innocent citizens, 150 citizens in just 10 days, we say that, suspicion itself, you say that there is a suspicion, what are you going to do about it? We clearly answered, Mr. Speaker, that what we're going to do is we're going to strengthen deterrence, and in case where the structure itself is disproportionate, we're going to make sure that there will be a third party, as you frame it, although we don't think that Egypt is a complete third party, intervene and make sure that the balance is there in place. Now to move on to the argumentation that I have to give you, Mr. Speaker, I have two things to tell you. First of all, what is actually the incentive of the surrounding countries? As we have heard from Hyun-na, yes, we do know that all those countries around, such as Russia, Russian Federation, United States of America, or France, they openly say their nominal reason, their nominal stance, is that they're going to keep neutrality when it comes to Israel's invading Gaza. The problem that we see from that is that the actual reality is when the conservative parts within Israel, because of the suspicion that the opposition speaks of, creates into them actually invading into those Gaza region, it becomes a serious problem. Why is that? Once again, because we see that the current status quo is actually different from the past conflict between Israel and Palestine, that those countries have more burdens, as they have explained. They have their own diplomatic calculus in place going on, making it more difficult for them to actually take any further action when there are clearly innocent citizens dying out there in those regions of Gaza. And we say that even if you say that those suspicions are we say that, well, we don't like suspicion. We believe that it's about time, as you say, if we were to actually achieve diplomatic things, we were to actually have a strength in the voice that we make, meaning that we actually want peace, and we actually don't want Israel to actually cause conflict ever again because of the suspicion that they haven't even characterized of how it is actually created in the first place. With that being said, yes.
If suspicion already exists and Israel is so easily provoked by suspicion of an arms smuggle, how is having Palestine more military power somehow lessening or decreasing the suspicion that Israel already has?
The fact is that, first of all, we do not completely buy what she had just said, that those people living in Gaza want to make weapons and attack Israel. That is something different, it happens situation by situation, so we cannot contest that upon in this debate. But even when we put that aside, the actual reality is, Israeli government, the conservative party that is in place right now, in power, tries to utilize that logic itself to actually go into those regions, to actually invade those Gaza, that the very logic that you speak of is actually used to attack those countries in Gaza. And what we say to them in return, because we clearly see that those people living in Gaza or Palestine, we clearly see this we clearly see that the principle of proportionality is not kept in place. We say that maybe it's about time that we have a third actor, like third party as you frame it, come into those regions and actually balance and tell those conservative people in Israel that you're not the only actor who can actually make military movements, but we can actually do something as well. But what we must differentiate, Mr. Speaker, is that we're not suddenly saying that, so we're going to have Egypt suddenly intervening. But we're saying that because we have already explained in the Prime Minister's speech how Egypt is doing a perfect job in mediating and making sure that conflict doesn't arise, escalate. What we're saying is that we do recognize, no thank you, the diplomatic measures that Egypt has taken so far, and we recognize that. But the thing is, because the current armistice, the symmetry that exists, is that the people living in Gaza has no choice but to rely upon the good intent of the Israeli people. Meaning that if Israeli people decide to attack them, they have no one to actually rely upon to. Because as I already explained in the beginning of my argument, all those countries nowadays have more things to value, more things to put into their calculus. Why is that? As the closing government has explained through the POIs, those Arab Springs, we see liberal democratic governments arising in those Middle East countries. So they have more things to take into consideration, unlike in the past, when all that you had to do was actually to calculate whether you're on the side of the communist side or you belong to the West side. It's not simple like that, Mr. Speaker. We explained to you how the diplomatic situation is much more complicated, how there are much more actors who are actually reluctant to actually intervene. That's why the French president and the Russian Federation president, they were very reluctant to actually show anti-Western positive attitudes when they actually saw Israeli attacking those Gaza people and Palestine. And same goes for all the other countries surrounding their region. It's very clear, Mr. Speaker, what we want to do, which is actually my second argument, why we want to restore proportionality. I don't have to explain really a lot. I don't have to put a lot of time explaining why the principle of proportionality actually matters when it comes to times of conflict. We do so because we believe that wars itself have a goal, but when the means clearly exceed the goal, if party A clearly wins and achieves the goal to B, we say that you shouldn't then extend your measures. You should stop using it because you already achieved your goal. Because what you do from that point on is you're only harming the rights of those people living in that area. No thank you. And what we clearly see is that the people living in Gaza, they face this kind of principle of proportionality harm every time that they see Israel coming into them, with the logic that the opposition is so much worried about that they might be making weapons. We say, first of all, they're suspicious. Yes, we do say that they may be suspicious, but because they're suspicious leads to actual practical physical conflicts in those regions, we say that it's about time that we do strengthen the diplomatic measures, but also ensure as a last resort that if your suspicion actually leads to physical conflict upon those innocent citizens, what we're going to do is to tell you with a strong voice and a strong intent and action that will not be the case. That what we actually want to see in this debate today would be that we clearly understand how this is leading. We're going to a better situation as we have than 10 days before. But we want to ensure, we want to sustain this peace. We want to make sure, Mr. Speaker, on the government side, that we want peace in times of when there is a conflict, we want it to end quickly, when in times of peace, we want it to be sustained. And in order for this to happen, we believe that there should be this deterrence that the Prime Minister has explained. We believe that our policy is the way to go.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. And now let's hear from Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
resolution, right? Not in fact who punishes Israel more, not in fact about what Israel did wrong, therefore there should be another party to say that they're wrong, but rather about the protection, about the events or the future of Palestine, whether we can maintain this peace, that rare and difficult peace that we maintain in the status quo. We tell you that the government has completely failed, Mr. Speaker, to explain to us why in fact the deterrence helps to maintain or sustain that peace, or in fact helps the future of Palestine to begin with. So as the last speaker of the opening government, I'd like to do three things as a whole. Number one, I'm going to explain to you about the concept of need for intervention that happened between the two parties that we talked. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about why Egypt is not in fact a viable candidate for any kind of intervention if there is necessity for intervention. Lastly, I'm going to provide to you a new argument coming from it's about the harms of how it aggravates the conflict, how it aggravates the situation in Middle East, and lastly, how it aggravates the situation with the international community as a whole. Let's move on to my first, clash, need for intervention. Now, we told you clearly, Mr. Speaker, that we do not think any state, any individual state, can simply endorse themselves and claim themselves to be the good cops because there's a problem. That's ultimately what we heard from the opening government, right? They told us basically, there's something wrong. Egypt can do it, wants to do it, why not do it, right? We tell you that's simply not a good explanation enough. Why? Because we think that number one, what Egypt's doing in the status quo is in fact okay, is in fact acceptable, is in fact what we want. Egypt working as a Muslim state, becoming a mediator, becoming a trusted party from Israel. We think that that itself is broken. They have tried to explain to you, Mr. Speaker, that it's somehow not mutually exclusive, that negotiation and the last resort thing can happen altogether. We tell you that can't happen. Why? Because negotiation ultimately means that you're trying to resolve the situation by coming to a middle ground between those two parties, say Israel and Palestine. That for the Israel to, in a way, compromise their situation, in a way to trust Palestine that Hamas is not smuggling weapons, to trust the Arab states around Israel, that there is no threat against Israel that's imminent enough for Israel to pick up guns and shoot at these Palestinians. We tell you that last threat, the resort solution, doesn't really work that way. The resort solution is in fact putting the gun in front of the Israeli government and telling you that if you fight, we will shoot. We tell you that's an excuse enough for Israel to pick up guns and fight. It's an excuse enough for Israel to not move forward with the negotiation tactic that's going on. We tell you that's in fact why no intervention should happen in the status quo. Secondly, the idea of why not Egypt. They told us, Mr. Speaker, that Hamas isn't armed enough. We tell you that their entire argument of proportionality is in fact promoting or endorsing the idea of arms race in terms of Middle East. We tell you that's in fact the exact situation that we want to avoid, where under the name of proportionality, these Egyptian states, these Arab states, pick up guns and intervene because they claim that they're armed enough, because they claim that they're involved enough. We tell you that's in fact, which I'm going to elaborate later in my argument, that's in fact the conflict, that's in fact the conflict that we've seen in the past, that aggravates the situation, that in fact sacrifices the people in Palestine, because ultimately what they're trying to endorse is a proportionality conflict that doesn't really look after the interest of the Palestinian people, but rather looks after the interest of the political tension, the political fights that happens in the Middle East that we want to ultimately, in a way, avoid. So let's move on to my arguments. My further rebuttals will be sit down. My further rebuttals will be incorporated. So let's look at the harms. We tell you the harm is very clear coming from opening opposition, that it aggravates the conflict in Gaza, that it aggravates the conflict in Middle East. Number one, why does it aggravate the conflict itself? My first wonderful speaker told you, Mr. Speaker, that the recent conflict happened because of the suspicion of weapons, because of the suspicion towards Hamas. We've seen ultimately, repeatedly, that Israel's biggest fear is Hamas gaining enough power to incorporate themselves with forces in Lebanon, to work together with the forces in Egypt. That's why Israel has an incentive to, in a way, aggressively self-defend themselves. We tell you that's exactly what happened in the case of 8 days conflict in recent days. We tell you that ultimately peace was reached, however unwillingly, however difficultly. Ultimately sit down. Ultimately peace was reached. So the ideal argument that we should be discussing right now is how to sustain these ceasefire. But nonetheless, we tell you Israel especially has sit down, especially has easily breakable resolution right now, easily breakable ceasefire right now, because the politicians, the people in Israel already conceded to using force to attack Palestine. Therefore, that ceasefire is easily breakable. Number two, we tell you, sit down. We tell you that damage is even bigger when the ceasefire is broken down because the Gaza is already destroyed beyond repair. Therefore, any further military action that goes on in Gaza is even more detrimental to the people in Gaza. We tell you, therefore, proving or telling Israel that we can attack you if you do anything again, if you do any kind of suspicious action again, it has a tendency to lead to more detrimental effects. It has a tendency to lead to more military action when the ceasefire is easily breakable and when the damage is beyond repair. Everybody sit down. Now let's move on to how it further aggravates the situation in the Middle East. Sit down. We tell you that, Mr. Speaker, Israel thrives on the idea, or it feeds the idea to its own people. Sit down. It feeds the idea to its own people that number one, the Arab region as a whole is against them. Number two, the Hamas is growing like a cancer, so that anytime they can be attacked in their own land. That's the idea that Israel feeds to its own people. That's the idea that Israeli politicians thrive upon. We tell you, Mr. Speaker, that's why we've seen case of Israel aggressively self-defending itself as we've seen. We tell you, therefore, the idea of last resort, the idea of an Egyptian state, a Muslim state, coming into their own land and attacking them whenever they have conflict within Hamas, which happens all the time, to be fair, partly because of Israeli government, partly because Hamas does resort to military action. We tell you it does two things. Number one, it urges Israelis to resort to aggressive self-defense even more because there's now the imminent threat of military action. Number two, it urges Israel to use justification of self-defense even rigorously. Why? Because they now have this justification as they can use in the international arena, in the international politics. We tell you further pushes away any possibility for Muslim states, for Arab states to negotiate or to come into peace with Israel as a whole. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, we tell you, in terms of international community, where America justifies itself as an actor in terms of the Middle East, we tell you these kinds of actions, these kinds of involvements can further be justified because now Egypt is acting itself as a good cop in terms of Muslim states, good cop in terms of conflict in the Middle East. We tell you that's not the situation that we want. Peace is for our policy, not theirs. So we're very proud of those.
Okay, I thank Deputy Leader of the Opposition, and that's it for the opening half. And now I invite Member of the Government to the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, opening opposition is totally irresponsible to today's context of this debate because they never show any unique mechanism why the current situation, negotiation of diplomacy is working, Mr. Speaker. We, Mr. Speaker, in order to make this negotiation functional, we need a certain military intervention. We need to stop the military operation which is conducted between Israel and Palestine. On that basis, we are supporting this negotiation as well in much better way. That's why we are still proud to propose this motion. I have two extensions from the opposing government. Firstly, I'd like to talk about why Egypt has the moral duty to stop the humanitarian crisis when you regard the unique relationship with Gaza and Egypt. Secondly, I'd like to talk about practical consequences, how that we can start the negotiation, how we can have more functional diplomacy by having ceasefire using this kind of defensive minimal intervention. But before that, 4 rebuttals towards the entire opposition's case. Firstly, opposition said this diplomatic power can be third party because there is a huge division between Israel and Palestine. If that's true, why in the current situation that they can say, under their paradigm, diplomacy is working, Mr. Speaker, because they are actually self-contradictory by analyzing the huge division between this guy Palestine and Israel, Mr. Speaker. They are totally contradictory in their case. No. Secondly, they told us after taking this proposal, the more people are going to die, the conflict will be exacerbated, like North Korea and South Korea example, whatever. But we say this is a necessary evil, and we believe Egypt and Israel have the incentive to minimize the casualty and to have the more constructive approach that we can have the direction of political dialogue which conducted between this Egypt and Hamas, uniquely having that Egypt as an effective mediator. We say if we see the long-term benefit, this is the necessary evil to sacrifice in the certain level. Third rebuttal. They told us the intervention cannot be a neutral thing, but it is not true. Two reasons. Firstly, that we can be a defensive, as the opening government has told you, that we don't have, Egypt don't have any incentive to attack the Israel military force further to exacerbate the situation under the current situation. Moreover, the Israel has the respect towards this kind of Egypt because having the successful rich history or successful achievement done in the past. Secondly, when you regard the relationship with Hamas and Egypt, it is not that much close, such as the Israel and the United States, Mr. Speaker. We are having certain political relationship, but we are not doing the same thing in the same track, Mr. Speaker. We say under the current situation, Israel can do a certain neutral attack. Secondly, even though this neutral attack can't be happened, but we don't have to do so because we regard the shares of power is asymmetry, and if we treat the all party equally, if we provide all support to both parties, we create another asymmetry situation. So when you regard one party or particularly vulnerable in the status quo, we need to provide more support for those people to equalize the situation, which is necessary to conduct the ceasefire. No. Fourthly, they told us Hamas or Israel people will fear and radicalize the military. First of all, they never mentioned the mechanism why those people have the incentive to conduct further dangerous consequences that might lead to further conflict, that might be more victim in the Israel, Mr. Speaker, this create this huge harm. So we can't see any incentive why those people have to do that. And we provide more easy option for those people. Stop the conflict and go to the negotiation table. That's the solution what we support. Because it is more easier for the Israel to defend their innocent citizens, defend their country, to keeping their sovereignty from the fear coming from the entire Arabic nation. Having rebutted it, moving on to the point. No. So if Egypt the duty to stop the humanitarian crisis, look at the situation. Egypt is concerning about Gaza in Gaza. For example, trading in illegal, so supporting through the underground tunnel, which is an essential portion of Gaza people. It's under the sanction and control by the Israel, Mr. Speaker. Because Egypt is the only one that can geographically capable to protect those kind of Gaza, Mr. Speaker. Because that's why Egypt is actually upholding or carrying important role to secure the humanitarian situation of Gaza contingent. That's why, in the current situation, if we see more threat, more hostility towards the humanitarian issue in Gaza, as a moral responsible actor, Egypt has to conduct more situation to fulfill its role. That's why the justification and moral responsibility that Egypt has. Moving on to the second extension. So how does Israel will stop this kind of attacking? Two mechanisms. First of all, Israel doesn't want to fight against the Egypt, no thank you, in terms of scale of military and warfare, Mr. Speaker. When you look at the Egypt military, they are actually strong, and they have the huge technology and advanced military with the tanks or airplanes, and moreover, if the Israel start to have a war against Egypt, this creates a threat or this creates imaginary situation that provide deterrence for the Israel that they have to face entire Muslim nation, including in this nation, Mr. Speaker. This provides the huge deterrence towards this kind of Israel people, and they never provide this kind of benefit. The one other current situation that Israel people has an incentive to keep going on. Before that, yes.
So what you're doing is escalating conflict by giving room for others to bar against what you have.
No. Let's keep on listening my speech. So under current situation that because they have continuous advantage, structural advantage, that Israel are more likely to continue the war against Gaza. But if we take the status quo, we can have a more equal situation, provide the hostility for this individual. So And secondly, if we stop this kind of situation, why we can create a diplomacy? Look at the Middle East war. Having the ceasefire, we had a negotiation to maintain the peace of Middle East. Look at the North Korea and South Korea. Because we have DMZ, because we have the ceasefire, then we can conduct the discussion on cooperative achievement. For example, in the Olympic Games, North Korea and South Korea party had the same, had cooperative entrance as entire one Korea, Mr. Speaker. But in the kind of war situation, we can never conduct this situation. But if we see the stop and if we provide enough deterrence for those areas, Mr. Speaker, we can provide this enough mechanism to do so. Because after taking this proposal, citizens' demand, citizens' priority will be shifted from the security, from the issue of war into the another thing, Mr. Speaker. For example, economical benefit, or for example, the compensation, or more further development and education investment for the future, Mr. Speaker. This creates towards Hamas, Mr. Speaker. This provides the only mechanism that can have successful negotiation we propose.
Okay, I thank member of the government, and now I call upon a member of the opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what the entire government then just doing today is, at the end of the day, they're escalating confrontation, escalating conflicts at the end of the day within that region. Mr. Speaker, we think they need to better characterize, especially the group called Hamas in this debate today, right? Because we're not simply talking about like a legitimate government who's been, serving their people and carrying out this legitimate form of governance, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day, if we better characterize and take a closer look at this group of people, we're talking about people who have been acting very unpredictably and who've been labeled as terrorists by many nations in the international society, Mr. Speaker. So we think at the end of the day, by actually giving a room for these nations to support these government groups, this is going to actually give more legitimacy to the government group, radicalized government group Hamas, and this is also going to escalate the very tension within that region. So having this said, let me move on to build up the rebuttal for it. Right. Firstly, Mr. Speaker, they told us how they need to, because we're in a time of ceasefire, we need to give them equal power, right? Because it's really hard to maintain ceasefire if they're not in an equal power leverage. Mr. Speaker, we think this is false, right? Because Hamas have been avoiding ceasefire, avoiding talks with Israeli government till now, and now they finally have agreed upon this ceasefire because their military leader Jabari was dead, killed by Israelites. Mr. Speaker, the reason why they finally agreed to come to such peaceful negotiation was due to their lack of capability to sustain their governance within that region, Mr. Speaker. Because the leadership was dead, it's now easier for these people to it's now more difficult for these people to organize themselves and actually continue their action of shooting missiles back to Israel, Mr. Speaker. So if we actively allow Egypt to be in that region in the first place, we think this is going to further give Hamas more room to actually regather themselves and gain their power again, and actually discontinue ceasefire and act very unpredictably at the end of the day. But secondly, they also told us this idea regarding why it has to be Egypt, right? Why they have moral obligation regarding humanitarian intervention. Mr. Speaker, we say, I'm going to talk to you why it shouldn't be Egypt, but it has its own interests involved, right? If we better characterize Egypt, we see when it comes to this conflict between Israel and Palestine, we see U.S. being at the back, standing at back of Israel, and all these Arab nations such as Egypt, Tunisia and Turkey and like Russia like supporting Palestine, right? We think Egypt has national interest to actually like make action that's not totally for the sake of humanitarian intervention due to its national interest, due to its position that it's taking in the status quo regarding this very issue, Mr. Speaker. We think if your entire goal is to, for the sake of protecting these individuals in that region, like prove to us why it has to be Egypt when it has like a national interest involved in that very action, Mr. Speaker, right? Like why not involve an international actor who can be actually neutral when it comes to such issue and who can actually help like these refugees like through UNHCR, right? Actually can help these people out within that region. They didn't really prove to us why it has to be exactly Egypt, especially when Egypt has exact national interest and national position when it comes to this very issue, Mr. Speaker. Another thing that they've told us was to start a very, from the closing, this regarding weird idea regarding how this is going to suddenly give rooms for Palestinians to develop education and be, very prosperous again. We think that was a very miss of linkage, right? They didn't really tell us why Egypt, according to their stance, they're only going to stand back and not take any action, but suddenly this is going to lead to economic prosperity. We think that was a very weird extension coming from the closing. But before I move on,
So ultimately, what you're supporting is the status quo. What has been that Israel can invade unfortunately people and the people die, and you're happy with that.
Mr. Speaker, firstly, we've told you how we finally came to a ceasefire, right? Which is a good sign to begin with to deal with the situation, especially when the very leadership is killed by Israelites, Mr. Speaker. We think this is the time is now, Mr. Speaker, to actually end this historical conflict and actually change this paradigm and weaken Hamas through this chance, Mr. Speaker. So what we're going to contribute to you from the closing half of the opposition side is the very effects this motion would have on Egypt and how this how the region's image and relationship with democracy is going to be weakened, right? Because firstly, Mr. Speaker, regarding Egypt, we think it's going to lose its competitive position in gaining legitimacy, and it's only going to strengthen biases being put upon themselves, Mr. Speaker. Because if we consider the very characteristics of Hamas, like I've told you, there are these extremist government party within Palestine, right? They're labeled as terrorist groups by many nations such as the US, UK, Japan, Korea, European Union, and many other nations, Mr. Speaker. For decades, we think in this debate today, government completely negated Palestine, Israel's side of the story, right? For decades, these Hamas people, they've been shooting missiles to Israel, sending unpredictable acts, and gave them the title to be labeled as terrorists at the end of the day. We think Egypt, by implementing this motion, you're actively supporting Palestine, and you're automatically depicting yourself as a government that actively supports this type of governmental form, Mr. Speaker. So at the end of the day, you're putting a negative image on yourself when it comes to international relations within the international community. But furthermore, Mr. Speaker, considering the very domestic situation of Egypt, it has just gone through overthrow protests and they just gone through new elections, right? It's in a status of instability, and we think firstly, when it comes to these citizens within Egypt, they have the right to be prioritized rather than having their new elected government to focus on something that's other than their own welfare. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to these newly elected governments, Muslim brotherhoods, we think they are already being questioned a lot by Western states because they've been known to not really supporting feminist movements and women's rights within Egyptian society, Mr. Speaker. So at the end of the day, you're giving more room for these US and other Western nations to actually hate and question the very forms of democracy within Egypt because you're actively supporting a group of terrorist groups through this motion, and you're not really carrying out the very meaning of democracy at the end of the day, although you've gone through election. So at the end of the day, you're labeling this entire region of Middle East and weakening newly formed democracy to be something that's against the value of democracy that the West wants. And that the West wants things is legitimate. So for these reasons, we think we take this debate home. Thank you.
Okay, I thank member of the opposition. And now let's have the final speaker from the government whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We agree that there is no perfect intervention in the argument. However, we want to point out there is no perfect diplomacy. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, generally it takes a lot of time for diplomacy to succeed in succeeding in stopping conflict in the first place. The question is, which paradigm is better? We believe, Mr. Speaker, now people are dying, and it's time to end the conflict as quickly as possible. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, as my partner clearly told you, Egypt is the best actor to intervene the Gaza Strip and stop as neutral position as quickly as possible in the first place. And my partner clearly told you about the incentive of Israel. Mr. Speaker, Israel never ever had the clear incentive to fight against Egypt further, precisely because, Mr. Speaker, Egypt is technically superior, no engagement coming from the side of all. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, we can clearly have the mechanism to stop this conflict as quickly as possible, and we have clear mechanism to minimize the harm of this conflict, and that's ground we're extremely proud to propose. To summarize this debate, I have two issues. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the necessity of the intervention in the Gaza Strip, and secondly, I'm going to talk about the effect of intervention in the Gaza Strip of Egypt. Moving on to the first issue about necessity. The idea first coming from the first opposition side is that intervention cannot be conducted by Egypt as a neutral stance, and this leads to enhancement of Israel's self-defense, and that's why it is not necessary. First response we have is that this is not true, precisely because Egypt is the most neutral actor between Israel and Palestine. This is the point of what my partner brought you from his speech. Precisely because Israel doesn't want to fight against in terms of scale or military, Mr. Speaker, because Egypt is technically superior, Mr. Speaker. If the Israel would fight against Egypt military further, Mr. Speaker, Israel clearly have detrimental harm from Egyptian military and so forth. That's why, Mr. Speaker, through this process, Egypt is the best actor to neutrally stop this conflict in the first place. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, Egypt is uniquely regional actor and improve, Mr. Speaker. If Egypt fails to stop the conflict, there are massive number of refugees from Middle East, including terrorists in Sinai Peninsula, Mr. Speaker. That is why, Mr. Speaker, in the current legal framework, Egypt trade with the people of Gaza Strip and send humanitarian aid. And for example, let's look at the history. In 1979, Egypt is a mediator of Camp David agreement between Egypt and Israel, Mr. Speaker. This example clearly shows the Egyptians' neutrality about the stance about Gaza Strip, Mr. Speaker. That in the first place, this is not true, and this is a contribution from the closing government. And second response we have, even this is true, Mr. Speaker, we, at least in the paradigm of the affirmative, we can stop the conflict at least as quickly as possible due to the unique nature of Egypt's military, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, we never ever clearly hear the mechanism of how diplomacy works under their paradigm, Mr. Speaker. In the current situation, people are dying. Humanitarian crisis is occurring, Mr. Speaker. We strongly believe the assumption coming from the side wall is that diplomacy works successfully and that there is no problem. However, Mr. Speaker, this is not true. Humanitarian crisis occurring. That is, Mr. Speaker, we want the world court and we want Egypt as a neutral mediator of this conflict. That is for two responses. Their first contention can be the valid reason to deny this proposal. Moving on to the second idea about we want to go.
Your context of debate is wrong because the ceasefire has been reached. The question is, how do we sustain it? You already told us that Egypt is based on Hamas, the Brotherhood. How is putting Hamas inside Israeli territory, in fact, sustaining the ceasefire?
In the first place, Mr. Speaker, because Egypt is a friend of Hamas, Egypt are more likely to to compromise from Hamas in the first place. Moreover, because Egypt belongs to the Muslim country, Mr. Speaker, Egypt has a clear incentive to stop the conflict as quickly as possible due to the nature of it geographically and so forth. That's why punctuation does not make sense. And the idea second coming from the side of is that after this proposal, Hamas is going to enhancing the strength of their own military, and that's why it is not necessary. However, Mr. Speaker, this is not true, precisely because in the first place, Palestine's military never ever actively in conflict with the Egypt government in the first place, precisely because Hamas is a friend of Egypt in the first place. And second response we have is that Hamas already get huge damage from the Israel, Mr. Speaker. For example, over 1,000 people are dying, Mr. Speaker. This example shows that there is no room for Hamas to strengthen his military further, and that is why their extension coming from the CEO is extremely nonsense. Moving on to the second issue.
So, are you saying that Egypt should take side with Hamas when they have been shooting missiles to Israel for decades?
No.
And showing signs of unpredictability?
No, Mr. Speaker. We strongly there is no perfect 100% act in reality. However, Egypt is the best actor more neutrally in comparison with other actors. Like the example, United States, like the example, many actors and so forth. That's why your point of view does not make sense. The bottom line of the entire proposition is that Egypt is a better actor in comparison with other actors in terms of intervention, in terms of solving difficulties in the first place. Their assumption is that there is 100% neutral actor, but Mr. Speaker, this is not based on the reality. Now is the time to end this conflict as quickly as possible. That's why your point of view does not stand. Moving on to the second issue. Mr. Speaker, as my partner clearly told you, after this proposal, the intervention on Egypt, intervention on Gaza Strip can accelerate the diplomacy between Palestine and Israel, Mr. Speaker. Precisely because after the proposal, Mr. Speaker, we can make negotiation between Palestine and Israel. Precisely because, Mr. Speaker, due to the existence of Egypt, both sides have no choice but to make compromise with each other in the first place. No engagement coming from the entire opposition side. That is why, Mr. Speaker, because of the existence of intervention, my partner characterized on this debate, we can accelerate the diplomacy they want to protect on this debate. That is why, Mr. Speaker, their assumption is not totally true in the first place, because their assumption is intervention doesn't link to the diplomacy. However, Mr. Speaker, we characterize it. Because of the intervention, we can accelerate diplomacy between the Palestine and Israel. That is why, Mr. Speaker, because there is no engagement coming on the entire position, we propose.
I thank Government Whip, and now I call upon the final speaker, Opposition Whip. Yep.
Mr. Speaker, we see a very unfortunate government bench forgetting to understand the context of what Egypt is, context of what Gaza is, and context of what Hamas is. Right? Mr. Speaker, it is clearly the closing opposition that clearly contextualized the situation and the characteristics of Egypt. We told you what Hamas is like, right? Hamas is a terrorist organization, right? It's very radical, right? Mr. Speaker, before going into any part of that, I have 3 points of rebuttals towards the government, and then let me go into my own questions. So first is about the military security guarantee, right? What the government bench wants. Right, Mr. Speaker, they have said that they want to intervene with military use and the use of arms in a very volatile situation where it's extremely necessary, right? On their assumption, right, because it's so volatile, because they have to use these arms, we believe that in
party is really, really important. Having a mutual agreement between the two parties where the intervention is necessary is very crucial. But what the government is doing is to destroy the neutrality, is to destroy the troops' trust and that notion of reliable party, right? We believe that Egypt is a very unreliable party, as they have said. They have the same root with Hamas. So how can they actually have a third and objective stance when it comes to Israeli and Palestine conflict when they're already siding with Palestine in these issues, Mr. Speaker? So we believe that their scheme, this military scheme, is not really good. But on the second point of rebuttal, they talked about the necessity and the human are dying and we need to go in for humanitarian reasons. Mr. Speaker, it's not like that the opposition is not sympathetic to the situation that's happening in Gaza Strip. We're also very sorry for those lives being lost. But the problem is under their scheme, what they're doing is to escalate the conflict and is to worsen the situation that is happening. Mr. Speaker, when we can see and can predict the situation so easily with simple logic, we believe that these things should not go on, right? And we already have like other players, those like international organizations or whatnot to go with, right? Well, on the third point of rebuttal, they assume that the situation will be better with these simple like Egyptian military going in. But Mr. Speaker, as we have contextualized and told you, the conflict between Israel and Palestine is no simple thing where you can just have a third party and magically get the situation solved, right? The conflict has been going on from 1948, where there has been conflicts and there has been like so many wars, like the 6-Day War, the Arab whatever war, and all of these wars didn't sort out the situation at the end of the day. And we believe that having these third party and just like barging in wouldn't solve the situation. No. Right, now let me go on to my rebuttals. But before I do that, let me just highlight this really, really important thing about debate, right? When we have an actor being involved, we have to ask them, can they do it and will they do it? In this situation about Egypt going in, can they do it and will they do it? We believe that the answers to those situations are no and no. We believe they cannot do it and they won't do it because it's not good for them, right? Tiani told you. So let me go to the two questions. The first is about how Egypt is not a good player, and second, how their scheme will worsen peace at the end of the day. But before I go on quickly.
So if you assume that we are miscontextualizing this debate, why we have the word invasion on this motion?
What?
If you say that we are miscontextualizing this debate, why we have the word invasion on this motion?
I don't understand why it's talking about these like word of invasion. But basically, Mr. Speaker, the reason why when we say that these like invasion of Gaza or whatnot is because we see those like conflicts going on, and that's sort of like portrayed in this form of invasion, right? And when these conflicts are going on, Mr. Speaker, in order to solve this conflict, you shouldn't add more guns, you should add more talks. So let me go on the first clash about Egypt. Right? The government has characterized them as perfect, they're respectful, they're Israel-friendly, they understand Hamas, they're a good player, they're proportional, and they have moral duty and they're compassionate. But Mr. Speaker, we believe that the opposition clearly told you, especially the post-opposition, why they're not good, right? First, on the point of Israeli-friendly, right? On the situation about the 8-day invasion, we already told you how Egypt is siding with Palestine. But on top of that, let's look at the regime and the characteristic that stays within Egypt, right? There has been, the Morsi from Muslim Brotherhood, right? We see more of the movements going in Egypt that goes for more radical, more Muslim and more traditional movements, right? That's why we see women's rights decreasing. And we see these Muslim Brotherhood supporting these random cells going in to Israel. For this reason, Mr. Speaker, we see that we cannot see how they're such a neutral party. But on top of that, Mr. Speaker, what they're doing is to escalate the conflict and make this Egypt not want to go in. No, because what they're doing is Egypt is aligning with the so-called terrorist group defined by UN, defined by USA, defined by so many other Western allies within the status quo. So by aligning and showing that they militarily support them makes other Western countries to turn suspicion and to question their intentions that we see, right? We already somewhat questioned the Egyptian regime. What happens is that with this model, it's actually worsened the question and worsened the intention and worsened the suspicion and the ambiguity we see at the status quo. So, Mr. Speaker, we clearly have told you and characterized why Egypt is not a good player. No. Now let me go to the second question about how their scheme will not solve peace. Right? No. So they said that this will basically solve the situation only worsening the status quo, right? It gives room for others to barge in, right? More justification for others to barge in because now a Hamas-friendly regime and Hamas-friendly military is barging in. Then what about things like Israel and other groups, right? We have to say that Middle East is a very volatile region where so many interests are involved. It's not just a conflict of Israel and Palestine. When we make room for other countries to barge in, we open rooms and justifications for other countries to barge in as well. We don't want a third world, right? So that's why we don't, how this is going to worsen the situation. But, Mr. Speaker, on top of that, there will be more attacks coming from Israel because of the simple fact that Egypt is behind them, right? The fact that they have a strong army or decided by them creates this room for Egyptian war attack. But on top of that, Mr. Speaker, it gives more room for Hamas to gather their power and attack them because now they have an institutionalized military to get the power and to escalate the conflict.